Story 1. The Security Guard. Years ago, I was a young man ready to work hard for every dollar. I got a job with a small cleaning service, tidying up office buildings after hours. My training was a 2-week stint in a decent-sized 5-story commercial building. Starting at 8 or 9 p.m., we'd work our way down from the top floor, long after the daily hustle had quieted. The first night, I met my coworker in the parking lot. As we walked together toward the entrance, my coworker casually mentioned, "Usually the security guard will let you in. If for whatever reason he doesn't, use the key." Simple enough, I thought to myself. The security guard was a friendly face, giving us a wave and a warm greeting. We responded in kind as we made our way to the elevator and up to the 5th floor. There we worked away, vacuuming, dusting, and wiping. Floor by floor, we worked our way down. It was this routine that went on for 2 weeks. After my training, the company decided I was ready to handle the building on my own. It was a Monday, my first solo night. As I approached the door, a strange feeling settled over me, and the absence of the security guard was noticeable. I remembered the instructions and used my key to enter. The building seemed to swallow me whole as the door clicked shut behind me. It was completely quiet, and took on a different tone and feel from my training period. As I approached the elevator, I was startled by an unexpected greeting. "Hey there," a voice called out from behind me. It seemed to emerge from thin air, and when I turned, I saw the security guard standing with a welcoming smile. "Oh, hi," I responded, a bit taken aback. "I didn't notice you when I walked in." "No problem at all," the guard replied cheerfully. With that exchange, I stepped into the elevator and ascended to the 5th floor. There, alone, the silence was almost a physical presence. The hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city outside did little to fill the void left by my absent coworker. I focused on the task, letting the rhythm of the work calm my nerves. The 5th and 4th floors whisked by in a methodical haze, but when I reached the 3rd floor, there he was again, the security guard. "Just making my rounds," he said, his voice somehow not as reassuring as before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd never seen him do rounds during my training. Nonetheless, I continued my work, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. By the time I reached the lobby after finishing my duties, the building was silent once more. The security guard was nowhere in sight. Maybe he's just making some more rounds, I told myself. Even so, the entire night had felt anything but ordinary. I locked up and headed home to get some rest. The next morning, my phone began buzzing nonstop. When I finally answered, my boss's voice was like a sledgehammer coming through the line. "What happened last night?" The question caught me completely off guard. There had been a break-in, and I was being summoned back to the scene. As I drove back, a million thoughts raced through my mind, none of which prepared me for what I was about to learn. The parking lot was a hive of activity, police and employees milling about with serious, concerned expressions. The building manager was there, his face stone cold as he and the officers watched me approach. Instantly, I was bombarded with questions. What time did I arrive last night? What time did I leave? Who was with me? Did I see or hear anything? But it was my question about the security guard that brought a hush to the group. "Has anyone talked to the security guard?" I asked. "He was there last night, and as far as I know, he was there when I left." The statement brought puzzled looks of confusion. "Our security guy died over the weekend," the building manager said, "in a terrible car wreck, Saturday morning." I felt my heart stop. That couldn't be. I'd spoken to him, seen him, just hours ago. The manager pulled up a photo on his phone, and there was no mistaking it. That was the man I'd seen last night. "He died over the weekend, and we haven't gotten a replacement for him," the building manager said. I stood there, my mind reeling, as the officers and building manager continued to question me. I knew what I had seen, and yet they were telling me that the security guard had died a few days before. More questions ensued, but eventually I was sent home with the promise that they would be in touch. Later that evening, the police called. They had made an arrest, an employee from the building. He had been up to no good. Hearing that morning that the building had no security guard, and knowing that the security cameras were faulty, he saw an opportunity. He broke in, avoiding using his keycard to prevent leaving a trace. The revelation did little to soothe my rattled nerves. It did nothing to explain my encounters with the security guard. I was so shaken, in fact, that I never returned to the job. I dared not enter into that building alone again. To this day, the events of those few hours linger in my mind. I had seen the security guard, spoken to him, and yet he wasn't supposed to be there. Some might say it was my imagination running wild, but I know what I saw, and it certainly wasn't my imagination. Story 2. Late Night Liquor Store Run. I worked in a liquor store in a small, quiet town years ago. When I say small and quiet town, that's exactly what it was. Nothing ever happened there, and it was easy to let your guard down. The idea that my mundane job could morph into something out of a nightmare was beyond my wildest thoughts. On a night just like any other, I was the unfortunate soul tasked with closing up the store that night. Normally, we never close with just one employee. Those rules are there for a reason, to keep us safe. But my coworker wasn't feeling well that day and wanted to leave early. So, without much thought, she headed off after the doors locked up. I stayed there, alone, working the drive-thru for a few hours before shutting it down as well. As I flipped the sign to closed, I ensured everything was locked and began working my way through the closing checklist. The quiet of the night was broken, however, when I began to hear a faint but persistent tapping on the glass door. Glancing up, I saw a figure shrouded in the dim streetlight, knocking on the door. My first thought was to ignore it. Policy dictated we didn't let anyone in after hours. But something about the figure's posture, a mix of desperation and urgency, made me reconsider. I approached the door cautiously, and through the glass, I saw a young man, probably in his early 20s, gesturing frantically. He seemed to be begging for something, his breath fogging up the glass. "Please, I just need to buy something quickly," he pleaded through the door. Everything in me screamed that this was a bad idea. We were explicitly trained not to open the door after hours, no matter the circumstance, but there was something disarming about his earnest expression. I hesitated for a moment, deciding on what to do. I hadn't yet shut down the register, so taking one more order wouldn't have been a problem. "You got cash?" I called out to the young man. "Yeah," he replied back. "All right, what do you need?" After taking his order, I walked back into the store to retrieve it. In my mind, I figured I'd unlock the door, get the cash, slip him the order, and call it a night. As I walked back to the door with his order, though, something told me that something wasn't right. I could feel it in my gut. Approaching the glass, the expression on the young man's face was different. Although he looked to be excited, it looked like he was faking it, if that makes any sense. It was almost as if something was about to go down, and he knew it, but he was trying not to give it away. But I felt like I was committed now. I was standing there, just on the other side of the door, with his order in hand. Telling myself to just get it over with, I began reaching for the lock. As I did, I could see the young man's eyes get wide and take a peek over to his right. It was just for a split second, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. My heart skipped a beat. There was someone else there, lurking just out of sight. I stopped in my tracks, my hand hovering over the lock. The young man's tone shifted abruptly. "Open the door. I got the cash right here," he demanded, his face contorting into an expression of frustration. My skin began to crawl. The situation felt increasingly wrong. I took a step back, shaking my head. "I can't, I'm sorry, we're closed," I said. "What? Are you kidding, man? You're standing right there with my order, and I got the cash right here." I could feel his anger emanating through the door. Meet me at the drive-thru window. I'll hand it over to you there," I said in a cracking voice. "Hell no," he retorted back. "I'm not walking all the way around when you're standing 2 feet away from me with my order." And with that, his fists began banging against the glass. "You gotta leave, man, or I'm gonna call the cops," I called out. Suddenly another man slipped into view. He was large and menacing, and he meant business. "Open the door now or I'll kick it down," he yelled out. At the sight of the second man, I dropped the order and ran to the back. As I did, I heard deep, loud pounding coming from the door. I was in a complete panic and ran for the phone. Just as I was about to dial, though, the banging stopped, and I could see the parking lot illuminate through the window. There appeared to be a car parked just around the corner, and whoever was in it was leaving in a hurry. I watched as the car zipped through the parking lot, out into the street, and disappeared into the distance. As quickly as everything had started, it was over. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, deciding on what to do. It seemed that the situation was over now, and if I made a call out to the cops or owner or anybody, me and my coworker would be fired for breaking the rules regarding working alone. After a brief few heart-stopping moments, I decided not to make any calls. Instead, I did my best to get myself together and finish up so that I could get the hell out of there, and that's what I did. As I finally left the liquor store, I sprinted to my car and made my way home as quickly as possible. Looking back, it's hard to shake the feeling of what might have happened if I had opened that door. I think deep down inside, I know something terrible would have happened. It was a lesson learned the hard way. Some rules are in place for a reason, and sometimes a simple act of hesitation can be the thin line between safety and peril. Story 3. The Graveyard Shift. Back in the late 90s, I was in my late 20s, working for a lawn care service in a small town not far from Nashville, Tennessee. We mostly tended to commercial and private properties, leaving the municipal jobs to someone else. I enjoyed it. I was young and liked not having to sit behind a desk. I enjoyed having autonomy without someone hanging over my shoulder all the time, telling me what to do. I had a lot of energy back then, and I'd work from sunup to sundown and not think twice about it. One hot summer day, my boss rang up with an unusual request. The town needed someone to clean up a cemetery on the outskirts. Just a one-off job, that day if possible. I knew the place he was talking about, and it always gave me the creeps. It was out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing. It was a lonely place, isolated and abandoned. Nevertheless, I agreed to do it. I was packed that day, though, so it'd have to wait until later in the day. By the time I reached the cemetery, it was almost dark. In those parts, dusk settles in around 7:30 in late August. It wasn't a very large cemetery, and I had a headlamp with me, so I wasn't too concerned about whether or not I'd be able to get it done. But at the same time, I didn't want to stand around and wait for dark to envelop me. After all, I was working all alone, and I didn't want to be out there any longer than I had to be. I got to work right away, zipping back and forth down the lines, ensuring that no blade of grass went uncut. Once I was done with that, I reached for the trimmer and began to take great care to clean up around all the headstones. It was getting really dark now, but I'd be done in about 15 minutes, and was more than ready to get out of that place. As a streetlight flicked on, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye, just down the street. It was an old, beat-up blue sedan. It looked to be from the early 80s, and it was pulling up with its headlights off, carrying a lone occupant. The car slowly pulled up under the streetlight and idled quietly for a minute before eventually shutting off. After a short while, an old man emerged. He was probably in his 80s, and he was dressed casually, but not too informal. He had a slow, steady gait. He had the look of a man that had been many places and seen many things over the course of his life. Like he had 1,000 stories that he could tell, if only he had the time to tell them. As he made his way through the cemetery, he walked towards the far corner, never once acknowledging my presence. He went straight to a particular headstone and stood there for a moment. Believing that he was paying his respects to someone, I shut off my trimmer, wanting to be respectful myself. For a short moment, all was quiet. He stood there motionless, just staring at the headstone. Not knowing what else to do, and wanting to remain quiet, I began picking up sticks, trying to mind my own business. It was then that he began to weep. His grief was palpable even from a distance. Whoever he was paying his respects to seemed to be someone that he cared about very much. As the minutes passed, his weeping grew louder, and I felt a tug at my heart. Caught between not wanting to disturb him and wanting to make sure he was okay, I grappled with the decision of whether or not to approach him. The sobbing continued, however, and I finally decided to approach. When I got about 15 feet away, I called out, "Hey sir, are you okay?" There was no response, just continuous sobbing. I edged closer, repeating my question. Again, there was no answer. I finally decided that I'd ask one more time, and if he didn't respond, I'd go back to where I was working and wait. Just as I was about to step closer, though, I heard a car door shut. I spun around, expecting to see someone at the old sedan, but to my astonishment, the car was gone. In an instant, with my attention towards the car, the weeping completely stopped. Before I could even process what was going on with the car and where it went, I whipped back around, and the old man was gone too. Vanished, like he was never even there. Shaken to my core, I stumbled back, tripped on my own feet, and fell to the ground. My eyes were wide and I started panting uncontrollably. I flew to my feet as quickly as I could and searched all around me. There was no one and nothing. The car, the man, they were both gone. Now terrified, I ran to my truck as quickly as I could, leaving my trimmer behind. The next day, I recounted the incident to my boss, but he laughed it off, suggesting I was seeing things. However, I couldn't shake the feeling of what I'd witnessed. It haunted me. I knew what I saw, and I knew what I heard. For weeks, I struggled with what had happened. I had so many questions, but no answers. Then, one day, I was at a diner with a friend and overheard two elderly men at the next table talking about an old friend. Old Man Henry, they called him. The conversation about Old Man Henry wouldn't have even caught my attention if not for the mention of the cemetery where I had my experience. "Him and that old beat-up blue sedan," I heard one of them say. My curiosity piqued. I approached the gentleman after my friend left. Hesitantly, and at the risk of sounding like I was crazy, I shared my experience, describing the car, the man, everything. The two gentlemen looked at each other for a moment. "That sure does sound like Old Man Henry," one of them said to me. He then recounted the tale of Henry and his wife, who were married for nearly 60 years. Years ago, she passed away. When she did, Henry was heartbroken and visited her grave daily, weeping inconsolably. Then one day he just disappeared with his car, never to be seen again. Their story chilled me to the bone. Could it have been that I had seen Old Man Henry, still mourning his beloved wife, even in the afterlife? I left the diner, not knowing what to think about everything. Even to this day, the mystery of that eerie summer night, when I worked alone in the cemetery, lingers in my mind.